A single bottle of cider sat on the mercantile windowsill, glowing like a trapped sunset. Outside, a line of bundled figures stretched down the snowy street, their breath pluming in the December air. They were not waiting for flour or salt, which were dear enough, but for this. For Elspeth's cider. Silas Croft stood across the way, his hands shoved deep in his greatcoat pockets, his face a knot of sour disbelief. He watched the door open and close, each time a coin trading for a bottle, and the sight was a physical pain to him. He, who had warehouses of grain, was worth less in this frozen town than the woman with the cellar full of amber liquid. He could not understand the arithmetic of it. It was an insult to the natural order of things, a world turned upside down by a stubborn woman and a heap of rotten fruit. Being right, he was discovering, was a cold and lonely comfort when everyone else was warm. The town had agreed she was a fool. Now the town stood in the snow, waiting for a fool's charity, and called it a miracle. 3 months earlier, the world had been a different shape. October had come in with a false summer warmth that lulled the valley's orchards into a deep, complacent sweetness. Then the frost had fallen, not with a gentle warning, but like a hammer of ice in the dark. It was a killing frost, a black frost, the kind that split bark and turned the late pumpkins to mush on the vine. At the Miller farm, the air was thick with the smell of ruin, an entire season's wealth, the red delicious and the northern spies that were Miller's pride, hung ruined on the branch. Their skins were cracked, a network of fine black lines spidering across their perfect roundness. By noon, they had begun to weep a little sugary sap that drew yellow jackets in a frantic, dying swarm. John Miller stood looking at his trees, his hands hanging limp, a man watching his own funeral. Total loss, he said to no one in particular. Not fit for pig feed. The townsfolk came to look, to shake their heads and murmur their sympathies, which were cheap and easy to give. They saw what Miller saw. Garbage. 800 pounds of it at least. A season's work turned to compost. Elspeth arrived in the late afternoon, her wagon rattling behind her old gray mare. She was a quiet woman, young to be widowed and alone on a scratch of land that no one else had wanted, a place up the creek with poor soil and too much shade. She walked through the rows, ignoring the pitying looks. She did not see rot. She saw the splits in the skin, the way the frost had shocked the apples, forcing their sugars into a desperate, concentrated burst. She ran a thumb over a cracked peel and felt the firmness beneath. She looked at the clear, cold sky and did the arithmetic in her head. It was a long and silent calculation. Finally, she found John Miller. "I'll give you $3 for the lot," she said, her voice even, "and I'll haul them myself." A ripple of laughter went through the small crowd. $3 for a mountain of trash. Henderson, who farmed the rich bottomland, guffawed. "What are you going to do with that, Elspeth? Build a new wall for your cabin?" She did not look at him. She looked at Miller. His face was a mask of shame and defeat. $3 was an insult, but it was $3 more than nothing. "Take them," he choked out. "Take them and be damned." So she did. Day after day for the rest of the week, she and the gray mare hauled off the ruined fruit, wagon load by wagon load, while the town watched and shook their heads. They agreed in the mercantile and at the church social that the poor woman's grief had finally unsettled her mind. The apples lay in a great, fragrant pile behind her small cabin, a monument to what the town called her folly. The scent of them, sharp and winey, hung in the autumn air. Her back ached from the hauling, and her hands were stained with juice, but a quiet hum of purpose had settled in her chest. She knew what the others did not. That value was a matter of perspective. A perfect apple was for eating. A perfect apple had a short life and a simple purpose. But a broken apple, a frost-shocked apple, had a different destiny. Its journey was not over. It was just beginning. She took a single, heavily split red delicious and walked the half-mile to Mr. Griesbach's place. He was an old German with hands like oak roots and eyes the color of the winter sky, a man who had forgotten more about orchards than anyone in the valley had ever known. He lived alone in a tiny cottage surrounded by a dozen gnarled, ancient trees that produced the sourest, ugliest apples imaginable, which he somehow turned into the most coveted applejack in 3 counties. He was, like Elspeth, an outsider the town tolerated but did not understand. He took the apple from her without a word, turning it over and over in his palm. He sniffed it, his great nose twitching. He pressed a thumb into the split, watching a bead of clear juice well up. The town saw ruin. Griesbach saw potential. "Yeah," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The frost does not kill, Elspeth. It sweetens. It is a shock, you see. It cracks the skin so the sugar can breathe. The old-timers knew. A hard frost makes for the best cider." He looked at her, his pale eyes searching her face. "They laughed at you." "It was not a question." "They always laugh at the thing they do not understand," Elspeth said. "Good." He nodded, a rare, small smile touching his lips. "Let them. A thing's only worthless if you believe what the others say." He led her to his shed and showed her his old press, a small, sturdy machine of iron and wood. "You will need to be clean, cleaner than a surgeon, and you must cut away the true rot, the brown softness, but the cracks, the splits. That is where the flavor is hiding. You are not making a pretty thing, Elspeth. You are making a strong thing." He taught her how to check the specific gravity with a hydrometer, how to pitch the yeast, how to listen to the gentle hiss of fermentation in the barrel, a sound he called the cider singing. When she left, the old press was in her wagon, and the weight of his belief felt heavier and more precious than any coin. His final words to her were an aphorism, the kind he was known for. "The sweetest juice," he'd said, patting the ugly apple in his hand, "comes from the ugliest fruit." She held that thought like a charm as she drove her wagon home, the scent of her supposed failure trailing behind her like a promise. The work was immense, a physical trial that pushed her to the edge of her endurance. She rose before the sun, her breath misting in the chill air, and worked until her lamp cast long dancing shadows against the cabin wall. First came the sorting. She built long tables from scrap lumber and spread the apples out, a sea of red and gold under the pale sky. With a small, sharp knife, she became the arbiter of each apple's fate. The ones with soft brown bruises of true decay were tossed onto the compost heap, but the ones that were merely split, their flesh firm and pale beneath the cracked skin, were saved. Basket after basket after basket. Her hands, already calloused from farm work, grew rough as bark. The tips of her fingers were permanently sticky. At night, she would soak them in hot water and salt, watching the fine cuts and scrapes burn white before tumbling into an exhausted sleep. The arithmetic of the task was daunting. For every 10 apples she picked up, perhaps 6 or 7 were usable. Still, the pile of salvaged fruit grew steadily, a testament to her unyielding patience. It was on the 3rd day of this relentless sorting that the boy appeared. His name was Finn, a lanky, quiet youth of about 14, from a hard-luck family down the road. He stood at the edge of her property for a long time, just watching, his hands shoved in his pockets. He was an outcast himself, too quiet for the other boys, too dreamy for his hard-handed father. He saw the town's mockery of Elspeth not as a judgment, but as a point of kinship. He did not see a fool. He saw someone engaged in a great and mysterious work. Finally, Elspeth looked up, her knife pausing over a split-skinned apple. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice not unkind. Finn shuffled his feet. "Just watching. There's plenty to see." She went back to her work, feeling his gaze on her. He stayed for another hour. The next day he was back. He did not speak, but he picked up a fallen apple and placed it on her table. It was a small gesture, an offering. Elspeth nodded her thanks. On the third day he came with a bucket. "I can carry," he said, his voice cracking slightly. And so their partnership began. He hauled the sorted apples to the washing trough, scrubbed them with a stiff brush in the cold creek water, and carried the heavy buckets of cleaned fruit to the chopping block next to the press. He never asked what she was doing, and she never offered an explanation. They worked in a comfortable silence, punctuated only by the thud of the knife, the slosh of water, and the cry of a distant hawk. He was the first person to stand with her, the first to join her mad enterprise. For Finn, her farm became a refuge. For Elspeth, his steady, unquestioning presence was a balm against the loneliness and the town's scorn. The press was a simple, brutal machine. Finn would load the chopped apples into the grinder, turning the heavy iron handle until the fruit was reduced to a coarse, wet mash called pomace. Then Elspeth would layer the pomace in cloth-lined racks, stacking them carefully inside the press frame. The final step was her part alone. She would position the great wooden screw and begin to turn the lever. At first it was easy, but as the screw descended and the pressure built, the resistance became immense. She had to put her entire body into it, her muscles straining, her feet braced against the wooden frame. And then the magic would happen. A tiny trickle of liquid, pale gold, would emerge from the spout. The trickle would become a steady stream, then a gushing flow pouring into the wooden bucket below. The smell was intoxicating, the pure, concentrated essence of autumn, of sugar and frost and earth. It was a scent of profound promise. They worked this way for weeks, turning the mountain of ruined apples into barrel after barrel of sweet, unfermented juice, which the old folks called must. Elspeth kept her secret in the stone-lined cellar beneath her cabin. It was cool and dark, smelling of damp earth, and now increasingly of apples. She had 5 large oak barrels, scoured clean with boiling water and soda, and into these she poured the precious liquid. After adding a small amount of yeast, as Mr. Griesbach had instructed, she fitted each with a fermentation lock, a clever little device that allowed the carbon dioxide to escape without letting air in. Soon a gentle bubbling began in the barrels, a soft, rhythmic plink-plonk that was the sound of the cider singing itself into being. She kept the cellar door locked. The town knew she had hauled the apples, but their curiosity had faded into a kind of pitying certainty. They figured she had tried and failed, that the fruit was now just a larger, more organized compost heap. Henderson made a joke at the mercantile about Elspeth brewing a vintage of pure mud. The laughter was easy and comfortable. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. One evening, after the last barrel was filled and singing, Elspeth drew a small measure from the first batch, which had been working for over a month. The violent bubbling had subsided into a quiet stillness. She brought the tin cup upstairs. Finn was sitting by the fire, warming his hands. She handed the cup to him. He looked at her, then at the cloudy amber liquid. He took a cautious sip. His eyes widened. He took a longer drink. A slow smile spread across his face. It's like drinking a warm slice of apple pie," he whispered in awe. Elspeth took a sip herself. It was strong and sharp, but with a deep, honeyed sweetness from the frost-shocked sugars. It was complex and alive, tasting of the very soil and sunlight that had made it. A quiet, fierce joy rose in her chest, so powerful it almost hurt. It was not mud. It was not failure. It had worked. As November deepened, a chill settled over the valley that had less to do with the weather and more to do with the state of the larders. The season had been unkind. The same frost that had split the apples had damaged the corn, and a wet spell in August had brought a blight to the potatoes. There was a quiet anxiety in the air, a tightening around the edges of the town's usual bluster. It was in this atmosphere that Silas Croft paid Elspeth a visit. Croft was the town's merchant, a man who dealt in grain, land, and the quiet desperation of his neighbors. He arrived in a polished buggy, his presence an intrusion of wealth and power on her humble homestead. He surveyed the neat woodpile, the clean, swept yard, and the now empty space where the apple mountain had been, his expression a mixture of curiosity and condescension. "Elspeth," he said, his voice smooth and falsely warm, "the town has been worried for you. A young woman alone, taking on such a messy burden." He gestured vaguely toward her cabin. "I trust you've disposed of that unfortunate purchase from Miller's farm." "It's been taken care of," Elspeth said, her voice betraying nothing. Croft smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "Good, good. Well, I'm here to help. Should you have managed to press any juice from that mess, I'd be willing to take it off your hands. As a favor, of course. For bulk vinegar stock, I could offer you, say, 5 cents a gallon." The arithmetic was a slap in the face. It was a price that didn't even cover the cost of the barrels, let alone her labor. He saw her as a fool to be fleeced. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Croft," she said, her gaze steady. "But I'm not selling." His smile tightened. The condescension in his eyes curdled into annoyance. "Don't be proud, girl. A thing's only worth what someone will pay. No one will pay more for vinegar stock made from rotten fruit." He left in a cloud of dust and indignation, certain he had made his point. 2 days later, fate intervened in the form of a broken axle. A freight wagon, hauling supplies for a fancy hotel in the capital, foundered on the rutted road near Elspeth's turnoff. The driver, a stout man named Charles who doubled as the hotel's head chef, was stranded. Elspeth offered him the warmth of her fire while Finn rode for the blacksmith. As dusk fell, she heated a small pot of her cider, adding a cinnamon stick and a clove. She poured a steaming mug for the chef. He took it gratefully, blowing on the surface. He took a sip. He froze. His eyes, which had been dull with fatigue, suddenly lit with an intense, professional focus. He took another, longer sip, swishing the liquid in his mouth like a connoisseur of fine wines. "My word," he breathed, looking at the mug as if it held the secrets of the universe. "What is this?" "Just cider," Elspeth said. "No," the chef corrected her, his voice full of reverence. "This is not just cider. The body on this, the depth, it has notes of honey, of vanilla, of the frost itself. I have tasted Calvados from France that was not this complex. Where did you get this?" "I made it," she said simply, "from the frost-split apples at the Miller place." Charles stared at her, his mouth agape. He understood immediately in a way the town never could. He saw the chemistry, the art. Before the blacksmith arrived with the repaired wheel, the chef had bought an entire 10-gallon cask from her, paying a price in silver dollars that made Elspeth's head spin. It was more money than she had seen in a year. As his wagon pulled away, he leaned out. "You have a gift, madam. Don't let any fool in this town tell you otherwise." The story of the city chef and the silver dollars for a cask of rotten apple cider spread through the town like wildfire. It was too specific. too tangible to be dismissed. The driver from the freight company confirmed it. The blacksmith had seen the money change hands. The town's easy mockery of Elspeth began to curdle into a confused, grudging curiosity. What had the fancy chef tasted that they had not? What secret was hiding in her cellar? The first tangible shift came from Mr. Henderson. He saw Elspeth in town, and instead of laughing, he gave her a stiff, awkward nod. The question was plain in his eyes, but his pride would not let him ask it. Elspeth simply nodded back and went about her business. She and Finn spent the next week bottling. Using money from the chef's purchase, she bought dozens of thick green glass bottles and a supply of fresh corks. They worked by lamplight in the cellar, siphoning the clear, golden cider from the barrels, leaving the sediment behind. The work was peaceful and satisfying. Each filled and corked bottle was a small victory, a tangible piece of her vindication. Finn, with a surprising artistic flair, designed a simple label, a pen and ink drawing of a single split-skinned apple. Underneath, in his careful script, it read, "Black Frost Cider, brewed by E. Vance." When they had 2 crates bottled and labeled, Elspeth loaded them into her wagon and drove to the mercantile. The storekeeper, a cautious man named Peters, looked at the bottles with suspicion. "I heard the story, Elspeth, but cider from those apples?" "Taste it," she said, handing him a small sample she'd brought in a jar. He sniffed it, then took a tentative sip. His eyebrows shot up. He tasted it again. He looked from the jar to Elspeth and back again. The calculation was visible on his face, his own skepticism warring with the memory of the chef's silver dollars. "I'll take a dozen," he said finally, "on consignment. We'll see if anyone's brave enough to buy it." The first bottle sat on his shelf for a day. Then a logger, chilled to the bone after a day in the woods, bought it on a whim. The next morning he was back for 2 more. "Warms a man right down to his boots," he declared to everyone in the store. Another person bought one out of sheer curiosity. By the end of the week, the first dozen were gone. Peters, looking stunned, asked for 2 more cases. The arithmetic was finally beginning to change. The $3 she had spent on the apples had become the chef's silver, which had become bottles and corks, which were now turning into a steady stream of coins in the mercantile's till. She was not yet wealthy, but for the first time since her husband's death, she was not poor either. She was solvent. She was secure. And the quiet, steady hum of purpose in her chest had grown into a clear, confident song. December arrived not like a gentle guest, but like an invading army. A blizzard swept down from the north, burying the valley in 3 feet of snow and locking it in a vise of bitter cold. The temperature dropped and stayed there, a relentless, punishing cold that found every crack in every wall and stole the heat from every hearth. The world shrank to the space between the cabin and the woodpile. This was no ordinary winter. It was a siege. And it was this siege that would invert the fortunes of everyone in the valley. The crisis began in the root cellars. The prolonged, deep cold penetrated the earth in a way no one had anticipated. The town's stored potatoes, the very foundation of their winter diet, froze solid. When a brief thaw came, they turned to a black, stinking slime. An entire winter's worth of food, gone in a week. Panic began to set in. Then came the second blow. The grain from the poor harvest, stored in Silas Croft's large warehouse, was discovered to have a fungal blight. The damp summer had fostered a mold that, in storage, had spread silently through the sacks. Most of it was inedible, some of it actively poisonous. Croft, who had been smugly sitting on his supply, waiting for prices to rise, was suddenly the owner of a warehouse full of worthless dust. The man who had lectured Elspeth on value now possessed the most valueless thing of all. The town was facing a true and terrifying hardship. Food was scarce. The firewood supply laid in for a normal winter was dwindling at an alarming rate against the unprecedented cold. A sickness, a deep rattling cough began to spread from house to house, thriving in the cold, crowded cabins. Fear was a constant companion, sitting at every dinner table where the plates were half empty. The town that had been so quick to laugh, so certain in its judgments, was now humbled, hungry, and cold. But in Elspeth's cellar, all was well. The stone walls, dug deep into the earth, had protected her stores. The cider, safe in its barrels and bottles, was untouched. It was more than just a drink now. It was warmth. It was calories. It was a tangible comfort in a world that had suddenly become bleak and frightening. Her foolishness had become foresight. Her worthless trash had become the town's most precious commodity. The arithmetic of survival had rendered its final, unsparing verdict, and it had declared in her favor. While the town shivered, Elspeth's small cabin was an island of quiet abundance. The first to come was the logger who had been her first customer. He knocked on her door at dusk, his face etched with worry. His wife had the cough, and he had nothing to warm her with. He offered to pay double the mercantile price for a few bottles. Elspeth looked at the desperation in his eyes, the same desperation she had once seen in John Miller's face in the ruined orchard. This was the moment she had, perhaps without knowing it, been working toward. She could become Silas Croft. She could name her price. The laws of supply and demand were wholly on her side. She could exploit their need and become the wealthiest woman in the valley by spring. The town almost expected it. It was the way of the world. She thought of Mr. Griesbach's words, "You are not making a pretty thing. You are making a strong thing." She looked at the logger's chapped hands, the weariness in his posture. She did the arithmetic again, but this time it was not about profit. It was about community. It was the arithmetic of how a town survives a winter together, or not at all. "The price is the same as it was yesterday," she said quietly, "and if you have no cash, I will trade. A day's work come spring for 4 bottles. Help Finn mend the fences for a week, and you can have a cask." The logger stared at her, his jaw slack with disbelief and a dawning immense gratitude. The news of her fairness traveled faster than the sickness. They came to her door in a steady stream, no longer with mockery in their eyes, but with a humbled, fearful hope. She treated them all the same. The price remained fair. She accepted barter for those who had nothing, promises of labor, a mended harness, a few jars of canned beans, a knitted shawl. She was not giving charity. She was making a different kind of investment. The most difficult visitor was Henderson. He arrived late one night, his face pale in the moonlight, his usual bluster completely gone. He would not meet her eyes. "My boy is sick," he mumbled, his voice thick with shame. "The doctor says to keep him warm. There's nothing in the house." This was the man who had laughed the loudest, who had publicly called her a fool. Elspeth could have savored the moment. She could have reminded him of his words. Instead, she went to the cellar and came back, not with a bottle, but with a heavy stone jug filled with cider, still warm from the hearth. "There is mullein herb in this, and a little honey," she said, pressing it into his hands. "Keep him drinking it." Henderson finally looked at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I have no money with me." "I don't want your money," she said. "When the ground thaws, you have 2 strong sons and a team of horses. My field needs plowing. You can help me then." He could only nod, his throat too tight for words. He turned and walked away, a proud, broken man carrying a jug of kindness through the snow. In that moment, Elspeth's victory was complete. It was not a victory of profit, but of character. She had had the power to gouge, and she had chosen to build. The town began to change. The transactions at Elspeth's door were more than commerce. They were the weaving of a new social fabric. The men who bartered their spring labor began to see her small farm not as a place of folly, but as a part of their own future. They talked of helping her expand the cellar, of building a proper press house. The women who traded knitted goods brought her loaves of bread and shared news. Her cabin, once a symbol of isolation, became the quiet heart of the town's survival. Finn was no longer just a helper. He was her recognized apprentice, treated with a new respect. He managed the accounts, his careful script filling a ledger with the complex economy of barter and coin, a record of the town's interdependence. The communal spirit that grew around her cider was a direct threat to the only power Silas Croft had ever known, the power of scarcity and debt. Ruined and resentful, he watched her influence grow with a venomous envy. He decided to break her. He confronted her in the center of town as she was leaving the mercantile. He was flanked by the town constable, a man who owed Croft a great deal of money. "Elspeth Vance," Croft declared, his voice ringing with false authority. "I have here a lien against your property for unpaid debts for supplies. Furthermore, the town council has received complaints of hoarding essential goods in a time of crisis." A crowd gathered, drawn by the drama. They were quiet, watchful. 3 months ago, they would have sided with Croft. Now they were not so sure. Elspeth stood still, her face calm. "I have no debts with you, Mr. Croft, and I am not hoarding. I am trading." "Lies," Croft sneered. "She's preying on your desperation." It was then that a voice rose from the crowd. "That's not true." It was Henderson. He pushed his way to the front, his face resolute. "She saved my boy's life, and she asked for nothing but a promise of help in the spring. She's done more for this town this winter than you ever have, Croft." Another voice, the loggers, joined in. "He's right. She's been more than fair." The storekeeper, Peters, stepped forward, holding his own ledger. "Elspeth has paid cash for every bottle and cork she's bought. There is no debt." The constable looked from Croft's furious face to the determined faces in the crowd and seemed to shrink inside his uniform. Croft, seeing his authority evaporate, made a final, desperate move. He turned on Finn, who stood beside Elspeth. "And this boy. No doubt he's been helping you cheat and steal from your own barrels. How did you know the count of every bottle, boy, unless you were in on the scheme?" Finn, who had once been too shy to speak, looked Croft directly in the eye. His voice was clear and steady. "I know the count, sir, because I am the one who writes it down. I know the name of every person who has traded and what they have promised. It is all in our ledger. Would you like to see it?" The simple, honest offer was devastating. Croft was exposed, his malice laid bare for all to see. He had no reply. Shamed, outwitted, and utterly defeated, he turned and stalked away, the crowd parting before him in silent judgment. His power in the valley was broken forever. The long winter finally broke. The snow receded. The creek began to flow freely, and the first green shoots of wild onion appeared on the south-facing slopes. The valley had survived. It was leaner, humbler, and more tightly knit than it had ever been. The rattling cough had faded, and the larders were being slowly replenished by the spring hunt. And at the center of this renewed community was Elspeth. The promises made in the dead of winter were kept. One morning, Henderson arrived with his sons and his team of horses, and by evening, Elspeth's field was plowed. The dark, rich soil turned over and ready for planting. The logger and 2 other men spent a week rebuilding her fences, stronger than before. A group of women held a planting bee, helping her get her kitchen garden started. They were not paying a debt. They were honoring a bond. Her small farm was no longer just hers. It belonged, in a way, to the entire town. Her cider was famous. Word had spread far beyond the valley. Letters began to arrive from merchants in the capital, from hotels and taverns, all asking to be put on the list for next year's pressing. She had contracts, real ones, that promised a security she had never dared to dream of. She and Finn planned the expansion. They would buy the adjoining acreage, the one with the slope perfect for an orchard of their own. Mr. Griesbach had already promised to help them select the right rootstock. One warm afternoon in late April, she walked over to the old German's cottage. He was sitting on his porch, smoking his pipe and looking at the new buds on his ancient trees. He gestured for her to sit. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the light change on the hills. "They don't laugh anymore," he said at last. "No," Elspeth agreed. "They do not." He picked up a gnarled, ugly twig from the basket beside him. It looked dead, but at its tip was a single, perfect green bud. He held it out to her. "You see," he said, his pale eyes twinkling. "The sweetest juice comes from the ugliest fruit." She took the twig and held it in her palm. She understood the aphorism completely now. It was not just about the apples. It was about the scorned land that could, with patience, be made to flourish. It was about the outcast boy who had a gift for numbers and art. It was about a town, brought to its knees by pride, that had found its strength in generosity. It was about herself, a woman left with nothing, who had looked at a pile of ruin and seen a future, glowing and golden and warm. She was not just a cider maker. She was a woman who knew the true arithmetic of worth.